Good morning, everyone. My name is Rya Stone, and I will be your host and presenter this morning. And I'm happy to be hosting our mini webinar on alternatives to RIFs this morning, reduction forces. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start off by introducing our core members of our team that you'll be working with closely when you're working with us at ClickOnHR. First off, we have Elizabeth Fletcher, our wonderful HR manager who's based out of Houston, who handles a lot of the project management of our HR projects. We also have Melanie Hernandez, our recruiter, who handles all of our clients' talent acquisition needs. We have also Hope Deanda, our wonderful HR assistant based out of Midland, Texas, and myself hosting this meeting this morning. If you have any questions, please type them up in the chat box of the Q&A session, and Elizabeth, our HR manager, and myself will get them addressed at the end of this mini webinar. Since it's a mini webinar, we'd like to present the opportunity for everyone to exit if they need to do so after 15 minutes, and then we can move into our Q&A section. So let's dive right in. As COVID-related mass shutdowns occur all over the country, layoff rates are surging at an unprecedented level. The recent wave of unemployment claims has already surpassed the most ever reported. And since it's been the most ever reported, the U.S. Department of Labor, since they started reporting in 1967 by over 9 times, which is an astronomical number. Some economists and the Federal Reserve predict that if this continues much longer, the unemployment rate in the United States will be exceeding that of the Great Depression. To follow, workplaces are also changing very quickly and dramatically this year in response to COVID. Among many of the changes, reductions force has been one of the biggest ones, which is what's causing the huge unemployment rate. Why is this particular topic of alternatives to RIFs a big topic at the moment? And that's because of 2 main things. The first one is going to be the Family First Coronavirus Act, known as FFCRA with the acronym, which was passed in March of this year. And that pretty much, the act pretty much covers any employees who are working remote that need childcare and are unable to work as a result. We need to be able to offer them expanded FMLA leave, which we covered in our previous webinar 2 weeks ago. So we want to make sure that we're following the legal cases to a T and not have a retaliation claim as a result of having to delay off a reduction force, when in fact this FMLA expansion leave covers even employers below 500 employees. The second being the payroll protection program, which is pretty important to discuss here. If you ever got any kind of funds from payroll protection program this year, then doing a reduction force affects how much of the loan amount is forgivable. And there's also penalties if you're doing RIFs during the calculation period, whether it's 8 weeks or 24 weeks. That's why this topic is of heavy importance right now, to see what alternatives employers have that they may not have considered, or if they've considered, what are the risks that go along with it. Beyond that, if everything is well and done and you've done everything to keep your workforce active, but there isn't enough work, then what are alternate options? Also want to take a second to emphasize how important it is for us to review these risks or exposures to alternatives, because first, government agencies are passing a lot of new employment laws in a very short amount of time to address the COVID-19 disaster. Secondly, in a classic trickle-down fashion, we're also seeing a lot of activity at state, city, and county levels. So once they pass at the federal, it moves down to city, state. So there's a lot of moving parts at the moment. And you do want to review these items because legal experts are expecting a surge in litigation in the next few months, because the laws are getting more and more complex, which means employers are more and more likely to make mistakes when doing RIFs or misinterpreting FFCRA, CARES Act, or the Payroll Protection Plan's terms. Secondly, when times get tough, employees are more likely to find fault with their employers or former employers to take legal actions. So let's take a look at what options we have to minimize risk while considering alternate RIFs. Today, we're going to share some of the strategies and to manage the RIFs, and we're also going to cover some items. And the items we're going to cover are voluntary layoffs, voluntary and phased retirements, and other strategies or other thoughts that companies have actually proposed and what their implications are. So let's dive right into alternative number 1, voluntary layoff. Now, not every organization is bold enough to think that this term is something that they can use because it just sounds weird, like voluntary layoff. Perhaps they're unsure about how to set the tone and worried about the business reputation, or they feel like they don't have enough cash reserves to sell the voluntary layoff package to make sure it's a lucrative package, or they're simply stuck with the execution. Basically, they don't know how to do it, or they don't know if the employees are going to see it as a voluntary layoff or how their clients are going to perceive it if word gets out they're doing voluntary layoffs. Now, I do ask that you consider this an alternative. The reason for that is because depending on how large your reduction force is, you want to consider this option because the key item here is that when you do a voluntary layoff, then warn notice is not triggered at that time period. Warn is triggered basically later on in the process if you're doing a voluntary layoff process. So our Federal WARN Act requires more than 100 employees or employers with 100 or more employees, not counting those that have worked less than 6 months in the last 12 months, and those who work an average of less than 20 hours to provide at least 60 calendar days advance notice of a plant closing or mass layoff affecting 50 or more people at any single site of employment. Basically, full-time employees who've worked for anywhere 6 months and up are going to be affected by these closures, and you need to trigger WARN notice. Now, that is the federal. I also want you to review your state WARN acts because at least 7 out of 50 states require state level WARN requirements. Like California has a mini WARN requirement that you have to meet as well. Good news is that if you have voluntary layoffs, then that pool of employees, as I mentioned, do not count towards your WARN Act calculation. And you can also successfully offboard their process, make sure that they have a proper exit, managing effective succession planning of the task, and determine if there's really a need for further RIFs. There have been times where Boeing actually did a voluntary layoff, and about 20% of their staff came forward to do a voluntary layoff, which is a number much more than what Boeing expected. But in turn, it allowed them to reevaluate their processes and procedures to figure out if they needed to make additional cuts or if the business was sustainable beyond the voluntary layoffs, which saved them a lot of time and effort past the voluntary layoff. So just something to keep in mind depending on how deep you have to cut. It's also easier to manage your general release and separation agreements without too much exposure or having to review protected classes as for long as all employees were offered this voluntary separation packet and the packages are consistent and fair. So not so great news, as I mentioned, as it happened in Boeing. You may also have employees that are high potential or that you highly value that may end up taking the voluntary separation packet. So be mindful of ensuring that this option is also truly voluntary. We want to be clear about it because we don't want to send out the messaging that right now it's a voluntary layoff, but if you don't take the voluntary layoff, you're going to be automatically laid off anyway. And that is in no way the messaging that needs to be sent across to the employee if the company is truly wanting to see where they can stop the bleeding. As I always say, the trick is in the execution. So you want to make sure that you execute correctly. So communicate through your typical and standard channels of employee communication. Don't veer away from it. Make sure you create timelines and outline expectations and next steps if they want to take on the voluntary layoff package. Also review your succession plan and your offboarding plan. You don't want to be left hanging after they all decide to take the layoff package and you don't have anyone to take on the task if work picks up or even to manage the existing workload. You also want to promote the message. What I mean by that is clearly explain to them what the benefits are if they take the voluntary layoff. Are you going to, as an employer, allow them to mark it up as a layoff in the unemployment claims, even though it's not required to, you're not required as an employer to approve those benefits? Or what about, outplacement services or the lucrative severance package, et cetera? So last but not least, create the incentives. So package it right, create the incentives, make sure it's a lucrative severance package where they're going to think about it and go, if I have this time off, what could I really do with my time at the moment and create value in my life? And don't forget the outplacement services. Those include everything from interviewing techniques, resume help, any type of job placement help that you might be able to do for them, along with the management of your COBRA packet offerings and employee assistance programs that still could cover up to a certain point in time, depending on how much help the employee may need. The next alternative we have is going to be voluntary or phased retirements. Now, several of the HR executives I've been working with this year are seeing rises and spikes in early retirements this year. And the reason for that is because this year, as we know, is completely different from any other year we've been exposed to. And even if employers are allowing employees to work remote, the concern or risk of potentially contracting COVID is forcing employees to reconsider retirement plans and whether they should retire earlier than planned. So if you've had an employee who has had retirement plans in the next 3 to 5 years in the books, they are now considering retiring a little bit early. And here are some items that you can do to help yourself if they do need additional information to make a decision. If you are doing a voluntary phased retirement plan, I ask that you carefully structure the plan to make sure it makes financial sense. And the reason for that is because it has to make sense for both the employee retiring and the company. And it's a little bit more of a lengthier process compared to alternative number one, which we just covered. So set the criteria. If employees with X amount of years of service and pay level and seniority are going to be the ones offering or being offered this voluntary retirement or phased retirement, let's set the criteria clearly. We want to create incentives, whether it's stock option buyouts that they may be waiting on, or mentoring the other staff members that's reporting into them, or retirement planning, and also outplacement planning. So if you need to bring in your broker who covers your 401k plans, talk to them about, hey, we know that you are planning on retiring. Here's the set select of employees we're offering some retirement planning courses for. Definitely do so. Now, as always, seek legal counsel before you do this, because there may be other nuances that you need to be considering. If you have a budget, then also do a phased retirement, which is basically instead of asking an employee or having an employee who's voluntarily retiring in the next 6 months, this could be a 2-year retirement plan or a 18-month retirement plan for that matter. You can make sure that it's phased out. And a phased retirement could mean different things, meaning they could even retire in 6 months and still be on some sort of retainer for ad hoc services. Now, what that does is it helps employees gradually exit the workforce over time, voluntarily, and it allows conscious and thoughtful succession planning for their mentees. Ensures smooth transfer of knowledge, which is really important, and it allows for development of high potential talent. So it's a very conscious effort, which is what I like about this phased retirement option. Now, a couple of considerations to keep in mind. If you have a defined pension plan, I know a lot of companies may not, but there's still a few that do, you want to review all those stipulations with your broker, because you don't want to inadvertently screw an employee out of their defined pension plan that they have been working toward for their retirement by taking a voluntary early retirement and disqualify them. So make sure to check with your broker on it. And if you are doing a phased retirement plan, budget for the length of time and how you want to phase it out. The corporate expenses and outplacement services, again, as needed, because there may be employees who need a combination of outplacement services in this stage. Lastly, we're going to cover other strategies that have been thrown around in the last 5 months during this COVID madness and confusion, which I do want to cover briefly some of the pros and cons. So let's talk about pay reduction or change in rate of pay. Again, this is the first instinctive response past RIFs that most companies did. Again, if you got the payroll protection program funds, they didn't allow for more than 25% of pay reduction depending on your calculation period and how you're planning on asking for forgiveness. So something to keep in mind is your PPP loan. And if you did get a PPP loan, what I do ask is that you make sure you don't violate any Fair Labor Standards Act, which is FLSA, meaning you don't want to put somebody or give somebody a pay cut that prevents them from being exempt any longer, meaning they don't qualify for the minimum weekly requirement of being an exempt employee. So a couple of things to consider, which we covered in our webinar 2 weeks ago as well. Next thing is partial furloughs, which has kind of been a hot button topic where companies are wanting employees to do partial work weeks, but then the rest of the work week, they're not compensating for them. Now, the idea here is that most states are offering work share programs, which is basically partial unemployment benefits if you're doing a partial furlough, as long as your furlough is not more than 40% of the workforce or 40% of the workload. So an employee can work 3 days a week, and unemployment benefits supplement the other 2 days of the week to make sure the employee is made whole or close to whole on partial furloughs. Now, pros and cons to this. Again, it's something you can execute if you contact your local workforce commission to set it up. The cons are, even if an employee answers an email or a phone call, then you're essentially required to pay them depending on whether they're exempt or non-exempt. So if they're an exempt employee and they're taking a phone call on a day they're scheduled to be off, you essentially, depending on the state you're in, might need to pay them for that whole week or that day. If it's a non-exempt employee, it's a little bit different because essentially they don't need to be furloughed, just doing a reduction in hours, which is an item that we also covered a couple of weeks ago. So the burden falls on us as the employer to make sure that IT turns off phones, laptops, all of that stuff on days they're not working, which only complicates client relationships, client calls, etc. So things to keep in mind. Another idea that's been floated around is, what if I lay off all my employees and bring them on as a 1099 contractor and then vary their hours? And again, I'm not saying that it's not possible to do that. You're more than capable of laying off an employee and bring them back as a contractor. I do worry about the co-employment illusion, which can land you in trouble with the Department of Labor, because essentially what you're doing is laying off somebody, bring them back on a contract basis, not worrying about payroll taxes or benefits or any of the other perks, but then you're still essentially employing them and doing a similar nature of work that they were doing the previous month or the week before. So again, be really clear about what you need to do and how it makes business sense, and check with your legal counsel always too. Another item that's been floated by us has been commission structure. What if I adjust the base pay and then to maybe a 50% pay cut or 40% pay cut, and then add on a commission structure of some kind? Again, be really careful with the exemption status, because that could put them in a salesperson exemption category. Also be clear about how long that might be, and make sure you're not violating any type of legal basis when it comes to their employment agreements. So if you already have an employment agreement with them, then we don't want to affect that by making a base pay change and a title change, or even without a title change, a pay change of some kind that can land you in hot water. Again, think through these, because the time it takes to solve some of these issues are a lot more complicated than planning ahead of time. The next one is reduced benefits. Of course, this is kind of fairly straightforward. A lot of company perks like gym memberships, allowances of any kind, car allowances have been halted. You can also stop your 401k match, depending on whether you're in a safe harbor plan or not. So check with your broker on that. One big thing I do want to highlight is, if you've done pay reduction or change a rate in pay, that is the qualifying event. So check with your broker on doing a special open enrollment to ensure that employees are given the option to drop their vision or dental or change their HSA or FSA at this point. And the reason for that is because there's been a huge decline of services in the dental service sector because of COVID-related fears. So now is the time to kind of look at all that, because that can actually save your company money if you're not paying the premiums for that employee who's dropping that benefit they're not taking advantage of. The next one that's been floated by us has been, or a strategy that's been we've come across, is more unpaid time off, which doesn't fall into a leave bucket. So it's kind of more of a sabbatical. Again, be careful how you clarify that, how we're coding that, because if you do give somebody 12 weeks of unpaid time off, then when they come back, can they go on FMLA at that point, or short-term disability, whatever it might be? Just be really clear about how that option can work out. But again, these are options that have been thrown around, so it's good time to think about these. If you want a sounding board of any kind, you can definitely call myself or Elizabeth at ClickOnHR, and we can definitely talk you through some of these things effectively. The next two items I have are fluctuating work week option, which is something we covered also 2 weeks ago. Basically, your non-exempt employees could go on a fluctuating work week. I do not recommend this unless you can effectively manage it, because there's a lot of confusion around a reduced overtime pay when it comes to the fluctuating work week option. So basically, if you assign a fluctuating work week to a non-exempt employee, the overtime hours they work can be calculated at a reduced hourly rate. However, it's a landmine, a legal landmine, because employees may not fully understand the legal barriers or gray areas that the employer may be working with, and it can lead to a quick lawsuit, and we don't want to have that. Last but not least, I'm sure a lot of companies have done this. They're renegotiating pricing with vendors, contractors, independent contractors, or staffing firms, etc. So these are some of the strategies that have been, sort of established. Now, I do want to share one last thing, which has just recently come up, which Google has also started, and something we ourselves considered in-house, was an employee share program, which is basically cost sharing an employee. Now, this is a little bit more feasible if you are in a company with multiple subsidiaries. And so, for example, if you have an employee who's in the drilling division that can now be cross-trained in the service division, as an example, then you can cross over employees and split the cost of the employee. I do think that that's a great idea. We ourselves have thought about it to cost share some of our employees with other HR advisory firms or safety compliance firms. Just be careful about how you cost code and also the legal implications around it, meaning your NDAs, your confidentiality agreements, most importantly, intellectual property. You don't want to cost share an employee with a potential competitor that you didn't know was a competitor when you started this process, et cetera. So again, work through your legal counsel on what that paperwork should look like. Also talk to your CPA about the taxes, the payroll taxes. So if your employee who's in the ruling division is going to go to Louisiana from Texas to work and do the cost sharing basis there, how will that affect payroll reporting? So check with your CPA on those. Most importantly, I ask that you keep accurate records of all hours worked. That is critical to making sure that whatever alternatives you decide to do on this slide deck, if you don't keep accurate records, we may not be able to effectively hold up our end of the bargain or defend ourselves as well. With that, we're wrapping up today's session, and we can address any questions that you might have right now. And feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat box. Okay, looks like we don't have any questions for this mini webinar. So I want to just thank each and every one of you for attending today. If you ever need any help, we're just a click away, and we can be reached at info@clickonhr.com and at 1-833-CLICK-HR. Also follow us on our social media platforms if you're already not doing so. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here today, and have a great day. Thank you.